We need good infrastructure to have a strong economy.
I think in 100 years, historians will look back at the Biden administration. What do you think the historians will be calling out in a century from now?
I do think that making the U.S. manufacturing base competitive again will be a strong part of the president's legacy. Being able to take your kids to school, having a road that doesn't have a bunch of potholes in it, and a bridge that's safe to drive on. All of these investments kind of really change the calculus of doing business in the United States in a way that I think is going to be very, very important for decades to come. And they do so in a way that I think is smart from a competition standpoint by having a very strong eye towards the places that are technology driven, that the U.S. needs to be competitive, because the linkage between good jobs and a competitive manufacturing base, the linkage between good jobs and a strong climate is a durable coalition to continuing these kinds of policies in the future.
All right, welcome to Political Capital number 10, Invest in America, the Future of U.S. Manufacturing. My name is Nate Loewentheil. I'm the founder and managing partner of Commonweal Ventures and the host of Political Capital. Political Capital is a conversation series exploring the intersection of technology, policy, and finance. Today we are joined by Joelle Gamble, former Deputy Director of the National Economic Council under President Biden, to discuss Biden's approach to industrial policy and what that means for the U.S. manufacturing and technology sectors. We'll also get an inside look at how presidential transitions work from someone who is an integral part of Biden's transition team, and talk about how Vice President Harris's economic vision is taking shape. I've had the great pleasure of knowing Joelle since she was an undergraduate at UCLA. After college, she joined the Roosevelt Institute and ran the Roosevelt National Network, an organization I myself have been involved with as an undergraduate. She went on to do a master's in economics at Princeton before eventually joining the Biden team, where she worked not just on the transition team, but at the National Economic Council twice, first as a special assistant to the president, and then as deputy director, where she was among the youngest ever to serve in that role. And in between, she was chief economist at the U.S. Department of Labor. She's been a leading voice on Biden's economic team, and we're really honored to have us here with you today, Joelle. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm glad we're doing it.
So, Joelle, let's start at the beginning. Whatever happens this fall, we're going to have a presidential transition. And few people get to experience what that's like from the inside. It's sort of a first draft of history. Give us a feel for what it was like working on a presidential transition. How did you get organized? What was your mandate? What was the day-to-day like?
Sure. And I think first draft is a great way to describe a transition because you are in some ways starting from scratch. And a lot of what we do is not the final product, but it's instrumental to getting to the final product. So it can be a bit of a crazy undertaking to do. But I think of the transition's primary function as bridging the gap between campaign and governance. You can only imagine how stressful and hectic it can be to be on a campaign. You're going 1,000 miles a minute. You're trying to translate a candidate's vision into policy at a very high level. You don't have time to get into specifics. And then in mid-January, you're expected to take office and start to get stuff done. It's really hard to go from that pace of work to something that's actually going to be governable. And that's the transition's job. So for my role, I was on one of many teams on the presidential transition. I was on the policy team working on both domestic and economic policy. There were other teams, personnel, people who were reviewing all of the work that needed to be done agency by agency. It's a sprawling operation, it's a lot of logistics. And most of it is done very, very much behind the scenes, especially when it starts happening before an election. So I joined the transition before the 2020 election. On the policy team, our job was to translate campaign promises into actual plans that could be administered or implemented through executive action or through Congress, which meant we were taking everything from the website, because before the election, we could not talk to the candidate. So we were taking everything that was put up on the website, everything from the Democratic National Committee platform, and meticulously articulating what we think could actually make that policy reality, filling in gaps, trying to find the legal authority if it would be done through executive action, if it couldn't be done through an executive order or some other action, trying to figure out what it would look like if it were to go through Congress.
Before the election, you can't even speak to the campaign. So you're like this third-party entity going through Biden's public pronouncements, essentially, and trying to think about how you would translate that into government action.
Yes, that's why it's so important that candidates pick people they trust to run their
Yeah,
transitions, people who they know share their vision, because they're going to be in charge of corralling a whole bunch of people to try to make that first draft, like you said,
right.
of that vision
It's that shift they always
real.
talk about, campaigning in poetry and governing in prose, and you guys were literally you were translating from poetry to prose.
Exactly, which meant Google Docs and Google Hangouts and all of those kind of platform ways of collaborating because this was during the pandemic.
Right.
So everything was virtual. I was sitting in my apartment in the same seat all day on Google Meet Hangouts, on phone calls, and in Google Docs, just trying to figure out how you would actually execute on the president's proposed agenda.
Wow. So it's sort of a shadow, not in a shadowy way, but not yet in power government taking shape, literally sitting in your apartments or homes around the country, hanging out on Google Documents, trying to figure out, what day one would look like.
Yes. And then when the president won, the pace only accelerated because now you've got president-elect that needs briefings. He has to make decisions. He has to, decide who's going to be on his team.
Yeah. And you guys sort of take over that process after the election, or you did.
We took for policy, we became the policy team that was preparing materials that went into briefing books. The personnel team then started to present options, right, to the president-elect for, Treasury Secretary or National Economic Council Director, or whoever then President-elect Biden was going to choose to lead his team. We were also integrating all of the campaign leadership into our team at the same time.
I imagine there's some politics that go into that, the lowercase p.
It felt smooth on my end, but I also think we had very, very good, humble leadership in charge of the transition. A lot of people who didn't actually end up going into government themselves, which in
Right.
many ways makes
They're
them
not
very
fighting for
trusted.
their own spot at that
Exactly.
point. Yeah. And of course, this was not the smoothest transition in the sense that the election was in fact contested by then sitting President Trump. That must have been a jarring experience for you guys.
It was very nerve-wracking, yes, in part because it was just so uncertain. A lot of people, like myself, quit their jobs to work full time for the transition. So there are a bunch of volunteers for the transition, a lot of experts who have been in government or in an industry and who know a particular policy area very, very well. There's also a core staff who, like people on the campaign, quit their jobs and work full time for the transition. And so for us, it was not, I wouldn't say more nerve wracking, but for me personally, it felt increasingly uncertain because, I was hoping to go in and that was my plan for a job. And after the election, you'd think it would be more clear that like maybe I have a pathway to a job, but in some ways it got less clear because the former President Trump was not actually admitting defeat. I will say I remember at one point on January 6th, I was just sitting on a call with someone who was reviewing policy for the Pentagon because we have teams who, review policy for all the agencies. We were talking about defense procurement, which is a big, big subject, especially since the Defense Department, it's a lot of money. And we're talking about the president's policies for that. And then I had the news on in the background, as one does, especially when
Right.
there are updates every day that could affect your work. And I just remember seeing the Capitol flash in the background and people climbing into the windows. And I was just in shock. I told the person I was talking to turn on the TV, and we just sat there and we
Wow.
were like, "What are we supposed to be doing? Do we keep working? this feels this feels like it could really upend everything that we're doing." And I think it's a testament to the transition's leadership and the president's leadership that they were able to communicate clearly the importance of keeping the work going, which is what we did. And eventually, we were able to enter government, but it was very, very well. There were a lot of roadblocks, not just on January 6th, thrown our way during that transition because the prior administration was not cooperative.
Right. Well, so needless to say, you had a lot riding both kind of personally and professionally on what happened, not to mention the peaceful transition of power. So a stressful couple, weeks there. But eventually you do come in, inauguration day happens. And then what's that like? I mean, you walk, literally walk into the White House, like are people rushing to grab the nice offices? What's that first day really like?
It's funny because it was still a time in which most people were not going into work, and that also applied to the new administration where we were following COVID guidelines. So at 12:01 January 20th, I believe that's the date, I closed a transition laptop and opened a White House laptop that had been mailed to me.
Literally.
I literally just closed one, opened another, stayed at my same desk I've been sitting in for months
Huh.
in my apartment, and I started trying to get the extension of the student loan pause cleared through a bunch of offices and agencies, including the Department of Education,
Wow.
full of people I had never met in person before. And then I spent the next 4 days trying to clear a Buy American executive order through basically every agency in the federal government, because
Right.
procurement affects every agency, including the Pentagon. And I had, again, never met those people before. So I never went into the White House until day 3, and it was only for a few hours to watch the president sign an executive order I'd been working on for months. And then I had to go back home and keep working.
It's a crazy thing to have a kind of transition of power for the most powerful government on earth. And you guys are just, again, working remotely, unable to really see each other, trying to figure out some of the most complicated policy in the world.
It is kind of wild. I mean, obviously, the president was in the White House. We all watched him walk into it on Inauguration Day and some very, very senior staff. But the president, I think, rightfully had his team following the same COVID
Yeah.
guidelines he expected everyone else to follow.
And notwithstanding that, did the work from the transition translate pretty smoothly? I mean, you said you were able to almost immediately start signing executive orders. So it seems like the work you had done was able to kind of, shift directly into governance.
Yes, I think so, except for, a few nerve-wracking minutes of wondering whether or not our transition documents had been cleared to go into the administration, because they actually have to be cleared. I think it's by the General Services Administration who does that. So you write all these memos and then you pray that you'll get them on the other side because they have all of your plans. But yes, it did, because the president got straight to work signing executive orders. You have to clear them through, a lot of people in government before they get signed, of course, including the Department of Justice. But uh, things got to going pretty quickly. I mentioned the student loan pause. That was a day one, I believe, action that he took. By American climate executive orders, immigration executive orders, supply chain executive, all of those sorts of things got done very early because people meticulously worked hard on them during the transition.
Right. But even so, I mean, you come into government, you have a bunch of executive orders ready to go, but it's not like the world's, standing still waiting for you to sort of get yourself organized. I mean, pandemic and there's politics and, global conflict. So, how are you both, playing kind of offense, trying to advance the priorities of the president, and I imagine also having to play defense as kind of new things come up. And, what was that first 100 days like in that regard?
I don't think I've ever worked so hard in my life for those first 100 days. I don't remember a day that I wasn't working. You work full days, which are not 8-hour days. They're like 12, 14-hour days during the week. You work 8 to 10 hours, maybe more on the weekend. I remember having 11 p.m. phone calls with our National Economic Council chief of staff while we were trying to get an executive order cleared through the wonderful team at the Department of Justice who
Right.
was clearing them on their weekends too. And so there was a lot of stressful days. And then there were, I will say, priorities that needed to be done, but sometimes could sometimes intersect, but sometimes run at odds. So obviously we had the COVID pandemic still raging. There was an ambitious plan to get the country vaccinated, to get personal protective equipment to everyone, to manage sprawling, complicated supply chains that were all related to health and safety. And at the same time, we were trying to, build a strong economic recovery. And you want to be able to keep people safe, but at the same time, you also want to be able to open up the economy. So I think
Right.
one thing,
Real.
yes, exactly. And so we were trying to pass the American Rescue Plan, which had parts of it that were particularly focused on the vaccination effort, but also parts of it that were focused on keeping small businesses open, helping colleges and universities, right, helping childcare facilities. All those sorts of things were all happening at the same time. So we were working with Congress to pass all those different provisions across all these different teams at the same time, while talking about the forward-leaning agenda, because the president campaigned on beating COVID, yes, but also he had an ambitious economic agenda that was about the future. So we were also, while trying to pass the American Rescue Plan, drafting what became the American Jobs Plan and the American Families Plan, also known as Build Back Better.
Right.
So that's a lot of policies that eventually became the CHIPS and Science Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. At the time, I was working on the manufacturing and R&D sections of those plans. So we're trying to propose a forward-leaning agenda while our appointees were still getting placed into roles in agencies. So there were cabinet secretaries who were not yet confirmed, but we had to make decisions. Their, front office staff were not yet there, though there were some people who were bravely and valiantly holding it down in these large agencies while people were still joining them. And so we were trying to draft quality policy that we could work with Congress to pass while trying to pass the American Rescue Plan to keep the economy afloat, while also trying to, beat COVID, which is not just about, it's not just a healthcare policy issue. It is a supply chain. It's a manufacturing. It is a trade. There are trade dynamics there in terms of some of the issues we had with PPE, et cetera. And so it was a sprawling effort, and I'm just very impressed with everyone I worked with because people managed to keep their eye on multiple balls at the same time.
I mean, it's interesting. It's like COVID feels so far in the rear view mirror. I mean, obviously it's still around, but not the same near the same level of priority concern. But I mean, thinking back to those days, it was all anyone was thinking about. People were dying every day, and the economy was still shut down. I mean, it's kind of an amazing moment to have been where you were.
It was quite a time. It was quite a time. It was at one point we were still alternating offices where, only one small share of each team would be allowed in the office at the same time. So it'd be like, do you have Tuesday and Wednesday? Who has Monday? Who has Monday, Thursday? That whole thing. But it was still a privilege to be able to work on policy that has such scale and the ability to help people at a time of great need.
Yeah. So you were there a little over a year, maybe 16 months, something like that. And then you shifted over to this new, substantially more senior role at the U.S. Department of Labor as Chief Economist. And I was looking back at the kind of track record of what the Department of Labor had been up to when you were there. And there were some pretty high profile matters. There was the railroad labor strike, which was potentially very disruptive to the economy and really, split the Democratic Party along some difficult lines. There were rules around gig workers, which is, continued to be a big issue in the economy. New standards for overtime eligibility. What were some of the kind of toughest policy challenges you were working on while you were there? And, what stands out to you in terms of what you guys accomplished?
Yes, I'm just so glad to have gotten to work at the Department of Labor. Being the chief economist was honestly my dream job that I never thought I would get. So I was really, really excited. Honestly, some of the labor economists I look up to most have had that position. And I was excited in part because, I think the data that the Labor Department produces is very, very important in market moving, but also because I think there was a team there that was very ambitious and very squarely focused on improving the lives of working people with a president who also has that as a clear North Star. I think some of the toughest things we had to work on, one of them was certainly the negotiations between the railroad companies and the unions, which Secretary Walsh was a lead figure on. I am not a labor negotiations person. I am an economist. And I was just asked, my job was to help kind of understand what the economic impact might be of a strike at different intervals. And there were external analyses. We also needed our own analysis as a government. This is not an easy thing to forecast, but I did my best. I think the goal was not to try to undermine the position of labor. In fact, it was to help the government plan, which is its responsibility in the case of any scenario,
Right.
right? Because the unions have a right to collectively bargain and get to a good contract, and the employers have a right to sit at the other side of the table and negotiate what a workable contract is for them. And we respect that. We just, as a federal government, also need to look out for
Right.
the entire economy and understand what the implications might be depending on the different outcomes of the negotiations. So that was what I was doing. And working with the White House, that was leading a kind of interagency process and trying to understand that. And so that was a pretty tough time because when you think about the implications would be large. But at the same time, you want workers, and I want workers, to have the best possible contract they can have.
Right.
These workers do work that is critical to the day-to-day livelihoods of Americans across the country, delivering critical chemicals that keep your pool clean, right? All these important commodities from agricultural products, right? And so these are just very important
Yeah.
workers to the U.S. economy. So that was a really big one.
Yeah, when I was at the National Economic Council, I was in charge of transportation, and it was a brutally cold winter in Chicago, and the rail yards froze. And it turns out, making up this
Mm,
number, 40% of all rail traffic in the country moves through Chicago. And so I remember, I mean, it's extraordinarily disruptive to U.S. supply chains when railroads stop moving. And for you, it's an interesting spot because the estimate about the economic impact, it's a very public figure, and it's going to weigh heavily in the debates and give ammunition to either side. Oh, it's not that big a deal. Oh, it's a really big deal. So you guys are put in a delicate political
right.
position.
Yes. And both Secretary Walsh, who is a card carrying union member, and President Biden obviously really, really respect the right to organize. And so I think it was something that people thought about really carefully
Yeah.
as they navigated those conversations. I will say it was very funny to be in the Department of Labor when both sides were meeting, because Secretary Walsh is a very like clever operator. At one point, they were not allowed to leave our building until they could to get it together. When that first agreement came out early in the morning, I forgot what day it was. It was because they had been basically kept in the Department of Labor all day, and the assistant to Secretary Walsh has worked for many labor secretaries, and she had a very fun strategy of basically serving increasingly lower quality food to everyone to incentivize them
Right.
to come to agreement. They were well fed, but it went from stuff you wanted to eat to stuff that, maybe was better for a kid's birthday party.
Right. Delicious omelet for breakfast and stale donuts by afternoon.
But yes, it was quite a time.
Yeah. So then you went back to the NEC and again got a pretty significant promotion now to deputy director. And as I mentioned, you were certainly among the youngest ever to hold that role. What was that job like? What are the responsibilities as deputy NEC director, and how was that kind of shift for you?
Yes, it's an interesting place to sit inside of the White House because, as you know well, there is a hierarchy. And it's a hierarchy that affects your ability to even move around the complex, right? So there are certain people who are senior enough to be able to just walk freely around the West Wing. And then you've got your interns, right, who are not doing that, and even a lot of full-time staff who don't have the natural permission to do that. And I think that hierarchy became even more apparent to me when I took on the deputy role, because I was high enough to be considered senior staff, but I was not
Right.
Lael Brainerd, the director. And so in many ways, I was kind of a place where the buck was supposed to stop for a lot of issues that came from our team, special assistants to the president, our policy advisors, et cetera. And at the same time, the place that tasks were often lobbed to from the senior staff. So I was that kind of like mezzanine layer where I was truly responsible for things, for outcomes, right? And for solving problems, and also responsible for keeping problems from going too far.
Right.
And it was a really important learning experience in that regard. Although in some ways it made me miss my job before, where I got to do much more policy design and creation, and versus managing the team that was doing that, which was still fun, and I really loved my team, but I was less involved in the creative process and more involved in the management of
Yeah.
all of the different the issues and the problems that came about. I was doing manufacturing and supply chain work, and we had a number of important labor negotiations, from UPS to the UAW and the auto workers. We had a number of supply chain related crises we had to deal with. It wasn't the chip shortage, which I was hoping to work on when I first joined the administration, but other issues related to both, of course, lingering effects of Ukraine, but also conflict in the Middle East affected shipping lanes, cross-border flows from immigration enforcement affecting rail traffic, all sorts of other kind of interesting and also potentially harmful um, events, right? And so there was a lot of dealing with that kind of work, a lot of regulatory actions that were happening that could affect the manufacturing base, and then, of course, a lot of implementation of all of the laws that Congress and the administration had gotten passed in the first 2 years, which is just a different kind of work.
What I hear you saying also is it was a different phase of the presidential administration by that point. I mean, you guys had passed these, epochal, major pieces of legislation, not just major for the time, but major in the course of U.S. history. But by that point in the administration, there was less big new legislation and more, we got to execute this. We got to implement all this stuff. We got to get money out the door. We got to reshape policies. It's much more execution.
Yes, exactly. Which I personally think is maybe some of the hardest work of policymaking. I think it's all hard, but once you've got an executive order signed or law passed, you actually have to make that policy real and felt by people in their day-to-day lives. And that was the focus of the White House and the whole administration when I went back.
Right. So let's shift gears now and talk. You started to talk about your work on supply chains and industrial policy. Let's kind of shift gears and talk more squarely about that. That's been one of the kind of hallmarks of the Biden administration and from the transition and from your first day, a big focus of yours. Maybe start by sketching out for us in kind of, big terms, what was President Biden's vision for U.S. manufacturing and what were some of the key pillars of his policy there?
So I think there's a lot of great folks who've articulated this, I will say up top, including Brian Deese, who was the National Economic Council Director when I first joined. And I had the privilege of working on his first industrial strategy speech for him. I think he lays this out very well, and it is obviously very, very close to the vision. So I would just recommend, listeners go back and maybe look at one or two of his speeches. I think they're really informative. But I see like a few key pillars that condense a bunch of different issue areas into one. One is I think the president believes that competitiveness and resilience for the U.S. industrial base comes from making things here or with partner and allied nations, right? I think the pandemic and, the conflicts in Ukraine, the Middle East have underscored the importance of supply chain resilience for prices and health, for just everyday Americans, because resilience means we have the ability to weather exogenous shocks in part. There's obviously other definitions of resilience aside from being able to weather exogenous shocks, but I think that that's very important. I think the competitiveness and resilience coming from making things in America and with partner and allied nations also has an economic logic to it that is not just about trying to avoid the worst case scenario. Because there are spillovers from manufacturing in terms of innovation, learning by doing, right? And also income for the communities in which manufacturing facilities are based, which has positive spillovers in terms of other, goods and services and other sectors. And so I think there's an economic logic there that is about what happens to communities and what happens to the kind of innovation ecosystem in America. You think about Shenzhen, for instance, in China, the kind of tech capital of China, and I think that argument becomes very clear because often we were talking about competing in manufacturing on the cost of labor, but we often forget about the technology side and where you're competing not just on lower costs, but also the ability to design and prototype and release new quality products quickly. And frankly, China's getting very good at that. It's a big conversation right now. And that's important for the United States too. That's why you see a strong tech bent, I think, to a lot of the work that's being done on, kind of reindustrializing the U.S. And I think the president also saw it from a dignity of work standpoint, that there is a dignity of work that comes from jobs that are not just about having a college degree, but instead a good job where you contribute to the community, you can physically see the results of your work, and that job gives you a chance to move up and take care of your family.
Right.
And then I think the last piece that I've heard the president talk about a lot, which is helping people who are left out and left behind. And so I think he has a strong sense of the importance of correcting for things like the China shock, where certain regions are hit really, really hard, or helping communities who have never really gotten a shot to begin with. And so you kind of hear that refrain in a lot of his remarks when he talks about manufacturing, and that's helping people who've been left out and left behind.
Right.
But there's an economic story there that he's trying to solve for. It's been happening over the past few decades.
So I hear there's sort of a national security and resilience piece to it. It's dangerous just not to make certain things in the United States. There's a piece about technological competitiveness. There's a piece about the fact that manufacturing has lots of other economic spillover effects. They're good jobs. They produce many other benefits in the economy. There's a kind of dignity of work piece to it, and that people without, a college or advanced degree should be able to have good paying jobs that are, good for the economy. And then finally, there's a kind of regional, equity issue, which is that, a lot of America used to be filled with manufacturing jobs and is not. And that's created, these sort of Rust Belt regions, and giving them another shot, is the right thing to do. And those are kind of some of the key pillars.
Yes, I think so.
And how did that translate then into some, specific initiatives that you were working on, whether that was around semiconductors or quantum computing or EVs? I mean, how did that translate into practice?
I think there's a few places where this translated into practice. One is a program called the Tech Hubs program,
Yeah.
which your listeners may be familiar with. It is a very popular program from the CHIPS and Science Act that I had the privilege of working on with the Department of Commerce as they implemented it. And that particular program is about helping regions all across the country, including regions who, have not historically been thought of as centers of technology and innovation, become competitive in the technologies that are important to U.S. competitiveness. So quantum computing, semiconductors, sensors, and lithium batteries, all these sorts of technologies that are really, really important to manufacturing competitiveness. Those are the areas that these regions are going to be focusing on, and it's really exciting because I think that that's a good model of grant making for the federal government because it essentially funds coalitions. It's not funding just one entity and hoping that entity has the networks in the community to get something done. Coalitions came together to apply for these funds
Right.
and are expected to work together moving forward. Coalitions of colleges and universities and businesses and labor unions, right? And these are the kind of anchor institutions and key kind of constituencies who you would expect to benefit from that kind of boost in innovation. And so that I think is a really good example of a program that kind of demonstrates a number of those different pillars that we talked about as a part of the president's industrial strategy. The other thing I would mention is, and I'd be remiss not to, is what I would call like the Made in America initiative, because the president talks about it every few minutes, it feels like sometimes. It's really a set of policies that the president had been pushing for, whether it's through federal procurement, through infrastructure spending, through tax credits, to really incentivize production in the United States. Obviously, it's important to have things produced with partners and allies. It's actually illogical to have autarky. You don't want everything made here, and the unit economics don't always work out. But it's important to make some things here from it, like we mentioned, a national security perspective, from a positive spillover standpoint. Those are things that are important. And so I think this one was really important because we're starting to see some indicators of success.
Right.
So first was just announced investments in the US. Some wonderful younger members of the National Economic Council team spent a long time culling all of these announcements from company websites, what we got sent to the federal government. It's become more systematized now, but it was very, very bottom-up effort to count all of the companies who had announced retooling of factories or new facilities in the US. So that was an important first indicator. We're now kind of in the second stage of measuring the success of that project, right? Because we're seeing some of these announcements show up in the national account data, where
Right.
exactly the real spending on construction of manufacturing facilities. It's kind of a hockey stick graph right now, where it's kind of relatively flat and then it just goes straight up. And that's at a record high, which is a sign that there are groundbreakings happening. Right? And then we'll have to wait and see if that translates into things like jobs, right? And in the interim, that'll take several quarters. So in the interim, we actually have to look at things like that might actually be a risk to those facilities being completed, which are things like permitting issues, high interest rates, policy uncertainty from the election year, all those sorts of things. But I think that kind of set of policies that were focused on encouraging domestic investments in manufacturing is really, really important. And it's been important to the president since, well, not just day one of his administration, but many, many decades before.
Must be satisfying for you to see those early leading indicators of real movement in the actual economy from a set of ideas turned into words on paper turned into policies, turned into money, now turned hopefully into jobs.
Yes, it is. It's very exciting, and now I'm just, fingers crossed that we can keep, both the economy on the right track and remove some of those roadblocks that make it hard for some of these businesses who are trying to invest in the United States to do so.
Well, let's get back in 1 second to the kind of future here. But, one other question on the industrial policy. How did you see it, or how do you see it intersecting with the technology sector? And I can see that both ways, in terms of how the industrial policies may have impacted the tech sector, but also how, the growth in AI may in turn impact the manufacturing sector, or should be. And I know this is something you've spent some time thinking about.
Yes, I think the industrial strategy is important for the tech sector, like you mentioned, especially so the investments that are going to be in the AI supply chain, like the investments from the Chips and Science Act, the investments in improving grid infrastructure, also very, very important to the growth of AI, especially as we get to more computationally expensive models that require more power. So I think that there's that kind of direct linkage between the two. But I see, AI and other forms of digitalization as very, very important to the competitiveness of the manufacturing sector. So things like generative design through technologies like digital twinning kind of can help companies prototype new products quickly. That helps them compete. I mentioned some of the some of the practices of a lot of these Chinese companies. They're able to prototype quickly. The U.S. has to find ways to do that too. And there are some companies who already do it well, but the diffusion of that technology across the manufacturing sector, I think, will be really helpful. You see some of the automakers doing it, some of the clean energy manufacturers doing it as well. I think things like predictive maintenance and teachless robots, which are all kind of AI powered ways of both helping to keep industrial robots in operation and help them adapt to factory floors, also helps, because part of the issue with the diffusion of robots in the manufacturing space is that they need updating, they need retooling. It can be expensive, it can be uncertain, and that'll keep people from adopting them or just keep them from using the ones that they have. And I say this because I don't inherently think that industrial robotics are labor replacing. I think they can be labor augmenting, and more competitive firms with higher output have stronger demand for workers. And so I say this with that view in mind. And I also just think that AI can help improve supply chain visibility and coordination, which is something you and I have talked a lot about, which is really, really important for increasing the efficiency of upstream suppliers, logistics and transportation providers. They all need some visibility into the supply chain as well. When all that data is centralized just in one firm, you can create inefficiencies and you can miss opportunities to course correct. And so there are all these ways in which digitalization and specifically the use of AI in manufacturing can make US firms more efficient, more competitive, which I think is good for GDP, sure, but also good for, working people.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen some great examples of, as you mentioned, AI systems to help fix industrial equipment. So there's, many, many different kinds of very complicated machines, each one of which has, 3,700 different moving pieces to it, and they all have to be operating exactly the right way. And even the most expert repair person is not going to have worked on the same machine every day. And so, using visualization tools or AI tools that can call up very complex machine libraries of knowledge to be able to, relatively quickly assess and fix is a great use case. We've seen really interesting stuff on the twinning you mentioned around battery performance. So there's an enormous variety of highly specific battery technologies that are required for different types of machines, and being able to test out in advance what's going to be required. Is this battery up to spec? Can save a lot of time and money for folks. So to your point, I think it helps make for a more competitive industrial sector. But I just want to reinforce the first thing you said, which is that, to have AI, you need a lot of energy and you need a lot of, chips. And, obviously that kind of infrastructural investment has been an enormous part of Biden, and in fairness, really bipartisan effort over the last couple of years to invest in that kind of stuff.
And that the bipartisan nature of some of those investments does really give me a lot of hope, especially in a fraught election year.
Right.
That it's still possible to get things done because everyone can agree that we need good infrastructure to have a strong economy.
Well, right. So some things are bipartisan, some things are partisan, one of which obviously is the presidential election. So I know, I have to imagine the Harris economic team shares a fair bit of overlap with some of your former colleagues. So, just based on what you're seeing publicly, How do you see Vice President Harris's economic vision taking shape, and what do you see as some of the key pillars there?
Yes, and I say this in full disclosure that I've been helping the team where I can. And so I think she's really focused on restoring faith in the ability of people to get ahead in the economy. And that sounds really broad and it sounds like a slogan, but I think it's a common theme throughout all of the economic policies she's released so far, from lowering costs, right? Talking about healthcare, which can be debilitating. Bankruptcies from medical expenses can really, really destroy a family's finances. It makes it hard to get ahead from, quality jobs. That's really important because you need breathing room, you need wiggle room to be able to get ahead. And then I think directly by saying getting ahead in the United States means being able to build wealth, to be able to have a cushion for yourself, which is why I think she's so focused on, you know, housing in particular, and has been a long champion of supporting small businesses in the United States, which is also really important wealth, especially for communities of color.
Yeah.
So I think this is all really a common theme in how she talks about things. And she also talks about folks who might make it harder for people to get ahead, people who are maybe not playing by the rules, and the importance of competition and going after people who defraud, whether it's student borrowers or seniors. That's all important too, because you want to have a positive agenda that's about all the things people need to be able to get ahead. And you also want to remove the barriers to them getting ahead and be really realistic about that. And I think she's doing that really well.
So kind of economic security and fairness
Yes. Yes.
as two pillars.
With a
Yeah.
big focus on being able to build wealth. And I think that that's been a really strong through line for her work as vice president.
Yeah, I noticed in her acceptance speech in Chicago, she mentioned entrepreneurship and capital businesses, which as a VC, I was very encouraged by.
Yes, I think that she's really into, from what I can tell from the interactions I've had, to supporting small businesses, supporting startups.
So as we wrap up, that's really helpful, especially given how close you are to the campaign. As we wrap up, I think in 100 years, historians will look back at the Biden administration as one of great accomplishment, especially on domestic economic policy. What do you see as the sort of single biggest accomplishment to come out of your collective work? What do you think the historians will be calling out in a century from now?
I do think that making the US manufacturing base competitive again will be a strong part of the president's legacy.
Yeah.
There's so much that got done, I will say, but all roads kind of lead to this being a hallmark of all the policies that he's gotten done, from the direct investments in advanced industries to the investments in infrastructure, which we all know is important for these industries to thrive. And of course, important for just, being able to take your kids to school, having a road that doesn't have a bunch of potholes in it and a bridge that's safe to drive on. But all of these investments kind of really change the calculus of doing business in the United States in a way that I think is going to be very, very important for decades to come. And they do so in a way that I think is smart from a competition standpoint, by having a very strong eye towards the places that are technology driven, that the US needs to be competitive. But it's also smart from a worker standpoint, from a middle class economic standpoint, because the linkage between good jobs and a competitive manufacturing base, the linkage between good jobs and a strong climate, is a durable coalition to continuing these kinds of policies in the future.
Well, Joelle, thank you for all your service to the country. Thank you for spending some time with us today. We really appreciate it. And I hope the industrial policies you help put in place continue to flourish and help our country drive forward.
Me too. Thanks for having me. This was fun.